The sky did not burn when the world ended. It simply boiled over. In a matter of hours, the heat of 1,000 dying suns descended upon Earth, and humanity's greatest leaders responded by forming a committee to discuss the matter. The Kalan Empire arrived without warning on the 4th of December. They did not come in peace, and they did not come quietly. Their armada blotted out the sun, consisting of colossal geometric dreadnoughts that defied gravity and reason. These were not mere starships. They were atmospheric incinerators. The Kalan utilized a highly advanced heat-based plasma technology that fed hungrily on ambient energy. They required massive amounts of external warmth to sustain their propulsion and weapon systems, making them virtually invincible in warm climates. When they dropped out of orbit, they targeted the equatorial and temperate zones first. New Delhi, Cairo, Mexico City, and Los Angeles fell within a single afternoon. The sheer thermal radiation radiating from the hulls of the Kalan ships turned asphalt into liquid rivers and vaporized reservoirs. Earth's conventional weaponry melted before it could even strike the alien armor. Deep beneath the Swiss Alps, in a classified subterranean bunker initially designed to withstand a nuclear holocaust, the remnants of the United Nations Security Council were engaged in a fierce battle of semantics. The smell of stale coffee and panic hung heavy in the recycled air. The French defense minister was violently gesturing with a laser pointer at a projection of the charred ruins of Paris, while the acting U.S. president argued with the Chinese premier over who had the authority to draft an official letter of capitulation. They were trying to apply terrestrial diplomacy to an apex alien civilization that viewed humanity with the same mild annoyance one might reserve for an infestation of termites. Doctor. Elena Rostova stood in the corner of the chaotic command center, her arms crossed tight against her chest. She was a climatologist by trade, a brilliant and notoriously abrasive mind from the Siberian branch of the Russian Academy of Sciences. A week ago, her biggest concern had been tracking abnormal jet stream patterns. Now, she was drafted into the Global Military Strategy Division because her predictive models were the only ones that successfully tracked the thermal wakes of the alien vessels. She watched the politicians bicker, her sharp green eyes reflecting the grim glow of the tactical monitors. They are debating whether to offer the aliens mining rights or outright terrestrial sovereignty. A voice murmured beside her. Elena did not turn her head. They are debating the color of the ribbon they want to tie around their own necks. The man who spoke stepped into the light of the monitors. Marcus Vance was a pragmatic, deeply weary U.S. intelligence operative. His tailored suit was covered in a fine layer of white dust from a near miss during his evacuation from Washington. His tie was loose, and he possessed the hardened gaze of a man who had spent his career watching carefully laid plans explode. He had been dispatched to Europe with one impossible directive: secure a functional, airtight alliance between the fragmented American military remnants and the Russian High Command, before either side did something suicidal. "Marcus Vance," he said, offering a brief nod. "I hear you are the only person in this bunker not currently drafting a surrender speech." Elena finally looked at him. She noted the exhaustion etched into his features, but also the sharp, calculating intelligence behind his eyes. "Doctor, Elena Rostova, and I am not drafting a surrender speech because I am too busy watching these creatures break the laws of thermodynamics. I am no scientist, Doctor. Speak to me in terms of bullets and blood." Elena tapped her stylus against the glass of the massive display screen. She pulled up a series of complex thermal graphs that overlaid the global map. The southern hemisphere and the equator were glowing a violent, angry red. The Kalan ships operate on an open-loop plasma cycle, Elena explained, her voice steady and commanding, cutting through the background noise of the panicking diplomats. "They do not generate their own heat efficiently. They siphon it from the atmosphere to stabilize their core reactors. They are essentially giant thermodynamic parasites. Look at the areas they have conquered, all high ambient temperature zones. They are soaking up our heat to power their shields and their weapons. Marcus narrowed his eyes, studying the data. So they brought fire to a warm fight. That explains why nothing we throw at them makes a dent. Our missiles just give them more thermal energy to absorb. Exactly, Elena said. But look at the atmospheric readings around their engine baffles. The exhaust they expel is absolute zero. They are venting pure cold. They have to, or their own plasma would melt their hulls from the inside out. Their entire technological paradigm is built on extreme heat exchange. And the politicians over there? Marcus asked, gesturing with his thumb toward the central table where the British Prime Minister was shouting into a dead satellite phone. They are looking at casualty reports and property damage, Elena said, a dry, dark humor coloring her tone. They see an invincible armada of fire. I see a glaring, catastrophic vulnerability, a systemic flaw just waiting to be exploited. Marcus stepped closer, invading her personal space just a fraction. He smelled of ozone and cordite, a stark contrast to the sterile air of the bunker. If you think they can freeze. I think, Elena corrected him, that a species completely reliant on absorbing external heat to maintain their biological and mechanical equilibrium has never encountered a true, unforgiving cold. They have surveyed our planet, noted the average global temperature, and assumed it is uniform. They are arrogant. Before Marcus could respond, the bunker's primary blast doors shuddered. A heavy rhythmic vibration echoed through the reinforced concrete walls. The lights flickered, casting long, erratic shadows across the room. The shouting at the central table abruptly ceased, replaced by a terrifying collective silence. A young radar technician at the front console spun around, his face pale. "Sir, we have a breach. A massive thermal spike just penetrated the European airspace. It is tracking straight toward this facility." The room erupted into chaos. Security personnel drew their weapons, a pointless gesture against the kind of firepower that had just glassed the Mediterranean coast. Marcus grabbed Elena by the arm, his grip firm but not bruising. How long before they melt their way through 500 feet of granite? 10 minutes, Elena stated, her mind racing. 15 if they want to be thorough. "Then we are leaving," Marcus said. He pulled a heavy encrypted data drive from his pocket. "My superiors gave me coordinates to a fallback point, a deep cover facility. But the window to reach the extraction transport is closing right now." Elena stood her ground, pulling her arm free. "I am not running to another bunker just to wait for the end. I need access to the Russian satellite network. I have an anomaly I need to track. Doctor, if you stay here, you will be vaporized along with the Secretary General and his surrender treaty," Marcus warned, his voice dropping to a low, urgent register. "Come with me. We have a transport waiting on the North Ridge. We can get you your satellite link." Elena weighed the options. The bunker was shaking harder now, dust raining down from the ceiling. The heat in the room was rising rapidly, the air growing stifling and dry. She looked at Marcus, seeing a man who valued survival over protocol, much like herself. "Fine," Elena said, grabbing her ruggedized laptop from the terminal. "But we are not going to your American fallback point, and we are going to Siberia." Marcus stared at her, genuinely surprised. "Siberia? Doctor, the world is ending, and you want to go to the coldest, most miserable place left on the map." Elena offered a grim, fleeting smile that made Marcus's heart beat just a fraction faster. "Mr. Vance, if I am right about their engines, Siberia is the only place on Earth where we have a tactical advantage. The Russian winter is coming, and I intend to introduce these creatures to General Frost. The reinforced ceiling above them groaned, glowing a dull, menacing orange. The extraction was going to be dangerously close, and Elena still had not fully decoded the strange, rhythmic signal she had intercepted on the Russian military band just before Marcus arrived. A signal that suggested humanity might not be entirely defenseless in the dark. High above the melting peaks of the Swiss Alps, Supreme Commander Vrax of the Kalen Empire watched a live feed of Earth's frantic leaders and let out a sound like grinding tectonic plates. It was laughter, born of absolute terrifying hubris. Vrax lounged in the command sphere of his flagship, the Ignis Prime. The ambient temperature in the room was a blistering 130 degrees Fahrenheit. A perfectly mild spring day by Kalen standards. His armored, obsidian-scaled skin absorbed the warmth of the command deck, his biology humming with the stolen thermal energy of a burning Earth. He flicked a taloned finger across a holographic display, swiping away a dozen desperate messages of capitulation from human governments. They offered gold, they offered territory, they offered subservient labor. Vrax found it deeply pathetic. To the Kalen, this world was not a kingdom to be ruled. It was a gas station. "Supreme Commander," a sub-officer rasped, stepping forward from a glowing plasma conduit. "His subjugation of the primary equatorial fuel zones is complete. However, our vanguard units attempting to pacify the northern temperate regions are reporting anomalous chemical resistance." Vrax did not look away from the burning globe. "Explain." "The primitive atmosphere in these regions is periodically expelling a hostile liquid solvent. It falls directly from the cloud layer. It is coating our thermal sensors, rapidly cooling our external hull plating, and causing severe annoyance among the infantry." Vrax let out a low, vibrating hum of amusement. "They are being attacked by liquid hydrogen-oxygen compounds. This planet is a damp, miserable rock. Divert more power to their personal atmospheric shields to evaporate the solvent before it touches them. Ignore the anomaly. The planet is a uniform sphere of fuel. Consume it all." On the holographic map, a massive, swirling blue and white vortex was gathering over the upper Eurasian continent, a stark contrast to the angry red covering the rest of the globe. Vrax dismissed it without a second thought. A species born on a tidally locked volcanic world had no concept of an axial tilt. They did not understand the subtle, devastating power of seasons. Far below the oblivious alien commander, the Swiss Alps were cracking open like a roasted nut. Marcus Vance kicked out the steel grate of a concealed ventilation shaft, hauling himself up into the biting, freezing air. He turned and grabbed Elena's hand, pulling the climatologist up just as a terrifying wave of superheated air blasted through the tunnel behind them. The classified UN bunker they had just fled was gone, reduced to a subterranean lake of bubbling slag by a localized orbital strike. "Move!" Marcus yelled, the wind whipping his voice away. The sky above them was a bruised, unnatural purple, streaked with the searing orange plasma trails of Kalen's scout ships hunting for survivors. The snow beneath their boots was rapidly turning to slush, the ambient air temperature spiking erratically. Marcus led Elena in a dead sprint across a jagged ridge, heading toward a cluster of snow-dusted pines where a heavy camouflage net hid their only ticket out of Europe. It was a sleek, matte black stealth VTOL craft, a relic of shadow wars and black-budget operations. Marcus tore the netting away, his breath pluming in the cold air. He punched a bypass code into the external keypad. The side door hissed open and they scrambled inside, sealing themselves against the chaos of the dying world outside. "Can you fly this?" Elena asked, dropping her ruggedized laptop onto the co-pilot seat and strapping into the harness. She was breathing hard, her cheeks flushed, but her eyes were entirely focused. "I can make it go up and I can make it go fast," Marcus replied grimly, sliding into the pilot's seat and initiating the pre-flight sequence. A landing is usually a negotiation. The VTOL's twin turbines roared to life, a deep bass thrum that rattled their teeth. Marcus slammed the throttle forward. The aircraft shot vertically into the air, clearing the tree line just as a Kalan patrol skiff swept over the valley. The alien vessel, a jagged wedge of glowing metal, instantly pivoted, its sensors locking onto the sudden burst of kinetic energy. A beam of concentrated thermal energy lashed out, vaporizing a 1,000-year-old glacier less than 50 yards to their left. The resulting steam explosion violently rocked the VTOL, throwing Marcus hard against his restraints. "Oh, hold on!" Marcus shouted over the warning alarm screaming in the cockpit. He threw the flight yoke hard to the right, sending the VTOL diving down the side of the mountain, skimming dangerously close to the jagged rock face. He knew stealth technology was useless against an enemy that tracked heat. The only way to hide was to blend in with a bigger fire. He aimed the nose of the aircraft toward the burning ruins of a sprawling alpine resort town in the valley below. They plunged into the thick, choking column of black smoke rising from the destruction, the VTOL's thermal signature instantly masking itself within the inferno. The Kalan skiff hovered above the smoke for a few tense seconds, its sensors confused by the massive field of ambient heat, before it turned and sped away toward the horizon to hunt easier prey. Marcus leveled the aircraft, blowing out a long, ragged breath. He flicked a few switches, rerouting power from the stealth baffles to the main thrusters. "All right, Doctor. We are airborne and momentarily invisible. You said we were going to Siberia. Give me a vector." Elena was already typing frantically on her laptop, the screen illuminating her face in the darkened cockpit. "Setting coordinates for the Krasnoyarsk territory. Specifically, a restricted exclusion zone roughly 300 kilometers north of the city." Marcus punched the coordinates into the navigation computer. The estimated flight time flashed on the console. It was a long haul over hostile territory. He glanced over at her. "You want to explain why we just traded a heavily fortified command bunker for the middle of a frozen wasteland?" "Because of thermodynamics. Vance," Elena said, her fingers flying across the keys. She brought up the same global thermal map she had shown him in the bunker. "The Kalan engines operate on an open-loop cycle. They are basically cosmic ramjets. But instead of air, they scoop up ambient heat. They compress it, feed it into their plasma cores, and then vent absolute zero exhaust to keep their ships from melting from the inside." "I remember," Marcus said, keeping his eyes on the ash-filled sky ahead. "If they stay in the warm zones, they have a limitless supply of ammunition and fuel." Elena continued. "But what happens to a ramjet if you suddenly cut off the air supply? It stalls. It chokes. If we drag these alien dreadnoughts into an environment where the ambient temperature drops violently and rapidly, an environment where there is virtually no free heat to absorb, their intake valves will starve. The open-loop cycle will reverse. Their engines will try to pull heat from their own hulls, freezing their structural integrity, while their plasma cores collapse from lack of fuel." Marcus let a tight, predatory smile cross his face. "Rapid thermal depletion. You're telling me the most advanced, world-conquering armada in the known universe forgot to pack a winter coat?" "They didn't forget. They simply don't care," Elena said, tapping the screen. "They observed our average global temperature and assumed it applied everywhere. They don't understand the concept of a harsh, localized winter because their technology essentially eradicated the weather on their own world eons ago. We are going to Siberia because December is about to begin, and the forecast is calling for historically, brutally low temperatures. We are going to freeze them out of the sky. It's a bold theory, Doctor, Marcus noted, banking the VTOL slightly to avoid a massive stationary cloud of superheated plasma lingering over what used to be Munich. But an entire armada isn't just going to follow us into the tundra because we ask nicely. We need bait. We need a way to fight back once their engines stall. And I highly doubt a few hunting rifles and snowmobiles are going to cut it against 10-foot-tall, heavily armored aliens. Elena stopped typing. The glow of the screen reflected in her eyes as she looked at him. The abrasive, cynical armor she usually wore seemed to slip for just a fraction of a second. That's why we are going to Krasnoyarsk 26. That encrypted signal I picked up on the Russian military band before the bunker fell? It wasn't a distress call. It was an automated system diagnostic. Marcus frowned, his intelligence training immediately kicking into overdrive. A diagnostic for what? An old Soviet-era geoengineering grid, Elena revealed softly. A theoretical project from the Cold War designed to manipulate regional weather patterns to freeze out an invading land army. It was supposed to have been dismantled 30 years ago, but the signal proves the deep core generators are still active. If we can reach the control facility, we won't just be waiting for the winter to come to us. We can weaponize the sky. We can pull the jet stream down and create a localized hyperstorm that will drop the temperature to minus 60 degrees in a matter of minutes. Silence hung in the cockpit, broken only by the steady hum of the engines. Marcus stared straight ahead into the dark, ash-filled clouds. His jaw was clenched so tight a muscle ticked in his cheek. Elena noticed the sudden tension. "Vance? What is it?" Marcus didn't look at her. He couldn't. Hidden beneath the thick Kevlar of his tactical vest, sitting right next to his heart, was a titanium data drive containing his final classified orders from the remnants of the Pentagon. Orders that explicitly stated if the Krasnoyarsk geoengineering grid was ever confirmed to be operational, he was to infiltrate the facility, secure its primary source code, and then detonate a tactical nuclear charge to ensure no foreign power could ever wield such terrifying control over the atmosphere. He was flying right toward the one weapon that could save humanity, knowing his standing orders required him to destroy it. "Nothing, Doctor." Marcus lied smoothly, pushing the throttle a little further forward. "Just doing the math on our fuel reserves. Better buckle in tight. It's going to be a cold ride." The ghost of the old world was dying on the radio waves, drowning in a sea of static and desperate surrender. Marcus Vance adjusted the facility's archaic long-range receiver, listening as the last remnants of human authority tried to negotiate with a firestorm. They had abandoned the VTOL 2 hours ago, plunging it into a deep ravine to mask its cooling thermal signature beneath tons of displaced snow. Krasnoyarsk 26 was exactly as Elena had promised. A sprawling subterranean tomb of Soviet brutalist architecture carved directly into the Siberian permafrost. The air inside tasted of rusted iron and ancient dust. Spools of heavy braided copper wire lined the freezing concrete corridors, leading toward a central control room that looked more like the bridge of a forgotten submarine than a weather manipulation station. Marcus stood before a towering communication console, his breath pluming in the frigid air. He had successfully patched into a heavily encrypted military frequency, establishing contact with the USS Leviathan. The nuclear submarine was currently sitting at the bottom of the Marianas Trench, housing the surviving members of the United States Cabinet and several UN delegates. And they were panicking. Over the crackling audio feed, the acting Secretary of State, a man named Sterling, was demanding authorization to transmit a blanket, unconditional surrender on all open frequencies. Sterling wanted to offer the Kalan full control of Earth's remaining nuclear and geothermal power grids, hoping to buy a reservation on a subjugated planet. Marcus gripped the edge of the console, his knuckles turning white. He knew he had to stall the appeasement faction. If Sterling broadcasted the coordinates of the global power grids, the aliens would immediately detect the massive energy draw required to boot up the Krasnoyarsk 26 geoengineering weapon. Elena would be vaporized before she could even type in the launch codes. "Hey, Secretary Sterling, this is Agent Vance, Blackbriar Actual." Marcus spoke into the heavy bakelite microphone, his voice cutting through the panic on the other end with icy authority. "You are not going to transmit those coordinates, and you are not going to surrender. Not today." The radio crackled with indignant fury. "Vance, we thought you were dead in Geneva. You do not have the clearance to countermand a presidential directive, Agent. We are out of options. Paris is glass. Tokyo is a crater. We are trying to save the species. You are trying to schedule our execution." Marcus fired back smoothly, lying with the effortless precision of a man who had spent his life in the shadows. "I have secured a localized Kalan intelligence corps. Their psychological profile is absolute. They view preemptive capitulation as a sign of biological uselessness. Species that surrender without exhausting their tactical assets are immediately subjected to orbital incineration to conserve terrestrial resources. If you send that transmission, you are painting a target on the Leviathan." Silence stretched over the secure frequency, heavy and pregnant with terror. Marcus knew politicians. They were driven by self-preservation above all else. "What is your play, Vance?" Sterling finally asked, his voice shaking. "I have secured a black site asset in the Northern Theater." Marcus lied, shielding Elena's true objective. "I need 48 hours of radio silence to execute a localized counterstrike. If I fail, you can hand them the keys to the planet. But until then, you stay dark, you stay deep, and you keep your mouth shut." Marcus cut the feed before Sterling could argue, ripping the headset off and tossing it onto the console. He had bought them a window, but it was incredibly fragile, high above the earth. The illusion of safety was already fracturing. Supreme Commander Vrax paced the searing command deck of the Ignis Prime, his heavy taloned footsteps leaving glowing indentations in the metallic floor. He was bored. The conquest of this waterlogged sphere was proving to be a tedious exercise in extermination. The bipedal inhabitants offered no sporting resistance, their weapons pathetically inadequate against Kalan thermal shielding. Then, a sudden chime echoed from the primary tactical display. A sub-commander stepped forward, his armored scales shifting nervously. "Supreme Commander, we have detected an anomaly," the officer reported, gesturing to a projection of the northern hemisphere. "A massive, sudden draw of electrical and kinetic energy. It is located deep within a hostile, low-temperature landmass. The energy signature does not match their standard fission or fossil fuel generators. It is incredibly dense." Vrax turned his massive head, his molten orange eyes narrowing. He looked at the holographic globe, finding the tiny pulsing beacon of heat illuminating the frozen expanse of the Siberian tundra. It was an insult. He had claimed this world, and yet some remnant of the indigenous population dared to power up a high-yield installation right under his gaze. He viewed the cold regions as dead zones, devoid of the ambient heat necessary for his fleet to thrive, but he would not tolerate defiance. "They hide in the ice like cowards," Vrax growled, a plume of superheated steam escaping his jaws. "Send the Sunstalker Vanguard. Tell them to cross the mountain range and reduce that facility to ash. I want the ice around it boiled away until there is nothing left but bedrock." Back in the suffocating darkness of Krasnoyarsk 26, the temperature was hovering just a few degrees above zero. To mask their thermal footprint from orbital scans, they could not activate the facility's life support heaters. Every single erg of power was being painstakingly routed from the ancient subterranean geothermal taps directly into the weather manipulation grid. Elena was a blur of motion, crawling over massive green phosphor mainframes and manually reseating physical relays that had not been touched since the fall of the Soviet Union. She was covered in a thick layer of black grease and frost, her breath coming in short, visible gasps. Marcus watched her from the doorway of the server room. He was struck by her sheer, unrelenting determination. She possessed a brilliant, fiery spirit that stood in stark contrast to the desolate, frozen tomb surrounding them. He walked over carrying a battered aluminum tin cup filled with lukewarm water, the best the facility's emergency rations could offer. He stepped up behind her and draped a heavy, moth-eaten wool military coat over her shoulders. Elena flinched slightly at the sudden contact, then relaxed as the weight of the coat offered a meager defense against the biting cold. She took the cup from his hands, her fingers brushing against his. Her skin was freezing, her hands trembling violently from the drop in core temperature. "Thank you," she murmured, taking a sip of the stale water. "I am currently trying to bypass a firewall built by a man who probably died before I was born. The grid is at 40% capacity. We need it at 80 before I can trigger the atmospheric inversion." "Take a breath, Doctor," Marcus said, his voice unusually soft. He leaned against the metal console beside her, crossing his arms. "You are going to burn yourself out before the fireworks even start." Elena looked at him, the harsh green light of the monitor reflecting in her eyes. The cynical armor she wore so well seemed to have cracked under the weight of their shared isolation. "I have to get this right. Marcus, if this sequence fails, if the ionospheric heaters don't align perfectly, we won't pull the jet stream down. We will just create a mild snowstorm, and those creatures will burn us alive." "You won't fail," Marcus said with absolute certainty. It wasn't empty encouragement. It was a factual observation. He had spent his life evaluating assets, calculating the breaking point of human beings. Elena Rostova did not have a breaking point. Elena managed a faint, tired smile. It changed her entire face, wiping away the harsh edges and revealing a profound, captivating vulnerability. "You are very confident for a man who is secretly plotting to destroy my machine." Marcus froze. The air in the room suddenly felt significantly colder. He maintained his neutral expression, but his heart hammered against his ribs. The titanium data drive sitting in his tactical vest felt like a burning coal against his chest. "I am an intelligence officer," Elena said quietly, turning fully to face him. "Well, I deal with data. You deal with secrets. But we both observe patterns. I saw the way you looked at the primary conduit when we walked in. I saw you calculating the structural weak points of the blast doors. You are carrying a heavy burden. Marcus, the Americans didn't just send you to babysit an alliance. They sent you to make sure nobody else could control the sky." Marcus looked down at the rusted metal floor grates. The geopolitical reality of their situation crashed over him. If they survived the aliens, whoever controlled Krasnoyarsk 26 controlled the global climate. It was a weapon of mass extortion. His orders were absolute: secure the code, detonate the facility, ensure American hegemony. He slowly reached his hand inside his vest. He saw Elena tense, her eyes darting to the movement, but she did not pull away. She stood her ground, trusting him in a way no one ever had. Marcus pulled his hand out, empty. He looked her directly in the eye, dropping the facade of the hardened operative. My orders belong to a world that burned to the ground yesterday morning. Right now, my only loyalty is to ensuring we have a tomorrow. You get the grid online. Elena, I will handle the rest." The space between them seemed to shrink. The shared defiance, the mutual recognition of each other's hidden depths, ignited a powerful, undeniable tension. Marcus reached out, gently wiping a streak of black grease from her cheek. Elena leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering shut for a fraction of a second, seeking his warmth. It was a quiet, desperate moment of connection in the face of annihilation. Before either of them could close the final inches between them, a harsh, mechanical alarm echoed through the concrete halls. The sound was sharp and rhythmic, vibrating deep in their teeth. Marcus spun around, rushing to the secondary radar terminal. The screen was painted with a dozen rapidly approaching crimson signatures. They were fast, they were hot, and they were descending. "Vanguard," Marcus stated, his voice devoid of emotion, his training taking over instantly. 12 Kalan scout ships just crossed the Urals. They are moving at hypersonic speeds directly toward this facility. Elena dropped her cup. It clattered against the floor, the water instantly freezing upon impact. She lunged back to the main console, her hands flying across the keyboard with renewed, frantic energy. "The grid is only at 60%, she said, her voice tight with panic. "I need more time to prime the atmospheric charges." "You don't have it," Marcus said, drawing his sidearm and checking the magazine, a useless gesture against alien plasma, but a necessary comfort. "How long until they are in visual range?" 5 minutes, Elena replied, staring at the telemetry. "And Marcus, I have to open the massive external silo doors to vent the exhaust from the deep core generators, or the entire facility will blow. When I do, we will light up like a beacon. They won't even need scanners to find us." Marcus moved toward the heavy steel doorway leading to the upper levels of the bunker. He looked back at her, the romantic tension of a moment ago replaced entirely by the cold reality of war. He needed to buy her those 5 minutes, even if it meant stepping outside into the frozen wasteland to draw the fire of an alien vanguard. "Open the silos," Marcus ordered, stepping into the dark corridor. "Get the sky ready to fall. I am going to go welcome our guests to Russia." The Siberian winter did not arrive with a gentle frost. It struck the earth like the hammer of an angry god. By the time the massive primary silo doors of Krasnoyarsk 26 ground open, the ambient temperature on the surface had already plummeted to a lethal 40 degrees below zero. Marcus pushed through the heavy steel bulkhead, stepping into a sprawling subterranean motor pool carved just beneath the permafrost layer. The air was vicious, biting through his tactical gear instantly. Sitting in the center of the bay was a massive, 8-wheeled Russian BTR-80 armored personnel carrier, heavily modified with thick thermal plating and a mounted kinetic railgun. Surrounding it were 4 grizzled Russian perimeter guards, their faces wrapped in heavy scarves, clutching their assault rifles with numb fingers. They had been stationed here for a war that never came, only to watch the world burn on their monitors. Marcus did not have time for introductions. He flashed his clearance badge and barked an order in flawless Russian, commanding them to prep the vehicle for immediate surface deployment. The lead guard, a massive man named Volkov, took one look at the burning sky visible through the open deployment ramp and nodded grimly. They had watched the alien firestorms consume the south. They were ready to fight back. Footsteps echoed sharply behind Marcus. He turned to see Elena running into the motor pool, hauling her ruggedized laptop and a heavy olive-drab mobile uplink backpack. Her face was flushed, her breath crystallizing in the freezing air. The grid is fully automated, but the localized thermal feedback from the exhaust silos is going to flood the control room with carbon monoxide. Elena explained rapidly, tossing the heavy backpack into the open rear hatch of the rover. "I have synced the weather manipulation targeting matrix to this terminal. The storm will follow the uplink. We are the bait." "Marcus, we have to draw them away from the bunker and deep into the taiga." Marcus hauled himself into the driver's seat of the massive rover, familiarizing himself with the heavy, analog controls. Volkov and his men piled into the back, checking their weapons with grim efficiency. Elena slid into the passenger seat, plugging her terminal into the vehicle's archaic dashboard. "Hold on," Marcus commanded, throwing the heavy transmission into gear. The rover roared to life, its massive diesel-electric engine protesting the cold before settling into a deep, guttural idle. Marcus slammed his foot on the accelerator. The BTR surged forward, its heavily treaded tires catching the iced-over concrete of the ramp. They launched out of the underground facility and into the blinding, absolute whiteness of the Siberian wilderness. The sky above them was a chaotic canvas of swirling black ash and violent purple clouds. Elena's weather grid was working. The ionospheric heaters had slammed into the upper atmosphere, violently dragging the polar jet stream down to the surface. A hyperstorm was brewing, merging the natural, brutal December blizzard with terrifying man-made meteorological engineering. They did not have to wait long for the enemy. Streaking over the jagged peaks of the Urals, a dozen Kalan Vanguard scout ships descended like glowing orange darts. They were sleek, aerodynamic wedges of hyperheated metal, designed to slice through the atmosphere and incinerate ground targets with pinpoint accuracy. Their sensors immediately locked onto the massive heat bloom of the open silos and the fleeing rover. "Here they come," Marcus stated, his eyes locked on the treacherous, snow-covered path ahead. The taiga was a dense, endless ocean of dark pine trees and deep snowdrifts. He threw the heavy steering wheel hard to the left, drifting the 8-wheeled behemoth around a massive, frozen oak tree just as a Kalan ship swept overhead. The alien pilot attempted to fire. A concentrated beam of thermal plasma began to gather at the nose of the scout ship, glowing with the intensity of a miniature star. Then, the hyperstorm hit them. The temperature dropped another 20 degrees in a matter of seconds. A wall of blinding, dense snow swept across the valley, driven by hurricane-force winds. The Kalan Vanguard, operating on their open-loop thermal intake cycle, suddenly found themselves starved of ambient heat. Elena stared at her monitor, watching the telemetry data stream in. She tapped a few keys, routing the aliens' unencrypted short-range communication channels through her translation software and broadcasting it over the rover's internal speakers. Warning: external hull temperatures dropping beyond operational parameters. A frantic, digitized alien voice echoed through the cabin. "Compensate by increasing intake flow," a second voice ordered, sounding remarkably annoyed. "The indigenous life forms are attempting to flee in a primitive kinetic transport. Incinerate them." "Commander, we cannot fire. The atmospheric density is abnormal. It is expelling millions of unique, microscopic crystalline structures. They are adhering to our primary visual sensors and rapidly draining our kinetic shielding." "Vaporize the structures." "We cannot. It is solid water. The planet is attacking us with falling, frozen water." In the back of the rover, Volkov let out a harsh, barking laugh. "They conquered the galaxy, and they are afraid of a little snow. Idiots!" Marcus risked a glance at the sky. The Kalan ship that had attempted to fire its plasma cannon was now shuddering violently. The supercooled air had rushed into its intake baffles. Instead of a devastating beam of fire, the cannon spat out a pathetic, sputtering burst of lukewarm gas that instantly turned into harmless, dissipating steam. The sudden thermal shock cracked the alien vessel's focusing lens. Their engines are stalling," Elena reported, a fierce, triumphant smile spreading across her face. "The cold is reversing their core polarity. They are trying to pull heat from their own armor to stay airborne." Above them, the terrified alien comms continued to play out in real time. The Kalan pilots were experiencing the terrifying reality of their own hubris. "The geometric structures are accumulating on the intake valves. We are experiencing total system freeze. The humans have weaponized geometry. One of the scout ships suddenly lost all its glowing orange luminescence. Its sleek obsidian hull turned a dull, matte gray as its internal heat was entirely sapped by the biting wind. The anti-gravity repulsors failed simultaneously. The ship dropped out of the sky like a massive dead weight, plunging into a deep snowdrift 100 yards to their right with a heavy, concussive impact that shook the ground. 2 more scout ships suffered the same fate within moments, their engines whining in a high-pitched pitch before completely giving out, sending them crashing violently into the dense pine forest. The vaunted Kalan vanguard was being entirely dismantled by a blizzard. "It is working," Elena breathed, her eyes wide with adrenaline and awe. She looked over at Marcus. The cynical operative was grinning, a genuine predatory expression that matched the wild danger of their situation. "Don't celebrate yet, Doctor," Marcus warned, his eyes flicking to the rearview camera feed. The scouts were just the appetizers. We need the main course. High above the localized hyperstorm, in the searing warmth of the upper atmosphere, Supreme Commander Vrax watched his vanguard units wink out of existence on his tactical display. He refused to believe a simple meteorological anomaly could defeat his forces. He viewed it as a direct, insulting challenge from whatever primitive military leadership remained. "They have deployed a localized energy-dampening weapon," Vrax growled to his sub-commanders, his talons gouging deep grooves into the metallic console. "Divert the main armada. I want the dreadnought Solaris positioned directly over those coordinates. We will crush their toy with the sheer, crushing weight of our thermal mass." Elena's computer chimed with a deafening proximity warning. The radar screen turned completely red. "Marcus," Elena said, her voice dropping an octave, completely devoid of its earlier triumph. "We have a massive thermal displacement directly above us. It is the size of Manhattan." The clouds above the taiga suddenly parted, not from wind, but from sheer radiating heat. A Kalan dreadnought, a colossal geometric nightmare of dark metal and glowing orange veins, slowly descended into the atmosphere. The sheer heat radiating off its hull began to instantly melt the falling snow before it could even touch the ship, creating a massive, terrifying fog bank that rolled across the forest floor. The dreadnought was so large it possessed its own gravitational pull. The pine trees around them began to lean toward the ship, their needles flash-frying from the ambient radiation. The hyperstorm was powerful, but the Solaris was a flying sun. It was actively fighting the weather grid, trying to boil the blizzard away through brute force. "Can the grid overpower something that big?" Marcus shouted over the roaring wind and the deafening, low-frequency hum of the dreadnought's engines. "I don't know," Elena admitted, her fingers flying across the keys as she tried to route more power from the subterranean facility to the atmospheric heaters. "The mobile uplink battery is draining faster than I anticipated. The cold is killing our own power supply." Marcus gripped the steering wheel harder. The ice beneath their heavy tires was becoming treacherous, melting from the dreadnought's heat and instantly refreezing from the ambient storm, creating a slick, deadly surface. If they slipped and crashed now, they would be flash-frozen by the environment or incinerated by the Kalan. They were trapped in a deadly race between fire and ice, acting as the fragile tether holding the storm together. "Then we drive faster," Marcus declared, pushing the rover's engine to its absolute limit, plunging them deeper into the blinding, freezing unknown. A colossal machine built to conquer stars was being brought to its knees by the simple geometry of a snowflake. The irony was as bitter as the wind tearing through the Siberian night. The heavy Russian BTR-80 plowed through the rising snowdrifts, its massive diesel engine screaming in protest as the hyperstorm battered its armored chassis. Marcus fought the steering wheel, his muscles burning from the physical exertion of keeping the 8-wheeled behemoth on the treacherous, invisible path. Above them, the Kalan dreadnought Solaris blotted out the sky, radiating a desperate failing heat that turned the falling snow into a blinding curtain of steam and instantly refreezing ice. Then, the rover's engine simply gave up. The extreme cold finally breached the thermal plating, freezing the fuel lines solid. The heavy vehicle shuddered violently, sliding sideways across a hidden sheet of black ice before slamming hard into a massive snow-covered embankment. The impact threw Marcus against his harness, rattling his teeth and plunging the cabin into sudden, terrifying darkness as the dashboard lights flickered and died. In the passenger seat, Elena frantically tapped the keys of her ruggedized laptop. The screen flashed a bright, angry red before going completely black. "The mobile uplink is dead," she announced, her voice barely a whisper against the howling wind outside. "The battery core just cracked from thermal shock. We are completely cut off from the underground facility." Marcus unbuckled his harness, his breath forming thick white clouds in the rapidly cooling air of the cabin. He looked back through the narrow viewing slit into the troop compartment. Volkov and his men were already moving, manually sealing the rear bulkheads and breaking out thick, foil-lined emergency blankets. They were trapped. "Can the weather grid sustain the storm without the uplink?" Marcus asked, his tactical mind instantly calculating their dwindling survival window. "For a while," Elena replied, her teeth beginning to chatter. "The ionospheric heaters have their own momentum now. But without the targeting telemetry, we cannot guide the storm to follow the dreadnought. If the Solaris manages to ascend past the troposphere, they will escape the cold and recharge their weapons." Marcus looked out the reinforced windshield. The massive, glowing underbelly of the alien ship was hanging dangerously low, illuminating the raging blizzard with an angry, dying orange light. He knew they needed a way to trigger the atmospheric inversion manually if the ship dropped into the valley. But right now, freezing to death was the more immediate threat. The temperature inside the disabled rover was plummeting at a terrifying rate. Marcus moved across the cramped cabin, pulling Elena from her seat and guiding her into the narrow space between the driver and passenger consoles. He wrapped a thick, insulated blanket around her shoulders, then pulled his own heavy tactical coat tight. Without a word, he pulled her against his chest, sharing his core body heat. Elena did not resist. She leaned into him, burying her face against the collar of his uniform. She was trembling violently, her brilliant mind temporarily subdued by the raw, biological imperative to survive. "I spent my entire career studying the climate," Elena murmured, her voice muffled against his vest. "I mapped the shifting of the polar ice caps. I predicted the desertification of the equator. But I never imagined I would die in a tin box, freezing to death under an alien sun." Marcus wrapped his arms tighter around her, resting his chin on the top of her head. "We are not dying here, Doctor. You brought the sky down on them. You proved they bleed." She looked up at him, her green eyes catching the faint ambient glow from the frosted windows. The harsh, abrasive armor she wore to navigate the male-dominated scientific community was entirely gone. She was just a woman fighting for her world. "You had orders to destroy my facility," she stated softly, a statement of fact rather than an accusation. "You are an operative trained to eliminate threats to your government's supremacy. Why didn't you do it?" Marcus looked down at her. The geopolitical game he had played his entire life felt utterly meaningless in the face of absolute extinction. The endless wars over borders, resources, and ideologies were a petty, childish squabble compared to the sheer scale of the Kalan threat. "Because I realized my government's supremacy relies on a planet that still has air to breathe," Marcus answered honestly. "I spent my life breaking things. Elena, toppling regimes, sabotaging networks, making sure the balance of power favored my side of the map. But you are trying to save the map itself. I decided I would rather freeze in the dark with someone who builds then burn in the light with people who only know how to destroy. Elena reached up, her freezing fingers tracing the line of his jaw. The space between them vanished. She kissed him, a desperate, fierce collision of warmth and shared defiance. It was a bridge built over the ashes of their old worlds, a silent promise between two cynical souls who had finally found something worth preserving. Marcus kissed her back, his hands gripping her waist, grounding them both in the terrifying reality of the present. Miles above their fragile refuge, the reality of the Kalan Empire was fracturing under the weight of its own arrogance. Aboard the Solaris, the atmosphere was pure chaos. Supreme Commander Vrax stood on the command deck, his massive, obsidian-scaled chest heaving as he watched a thin layer of frost crystallize across his primary tactical displays. The ambient temperature in the command sphere had dropped to 50 degrees Fahrenheit, a lethal, agonizing chill for a species born of volcanic heat. "Supreme Commander, the primary intake valves are frozen shut," a sub-commander reported, his voice vibrating with pain as his armor sapped the remaining warmth from his body. "The open-loop cycle has completely failed. The core is attempting to draw heat from the ship's internal bulkheads to maintain plasma cohesion." Vrax slammed his fist into the console, shattering the frosted glass. "Reroute power from the kinetic shields. Ignite the secondary fusion burners, burn the ice away." "We cannot," a second officer shouted, abandoning the strict military decorum of the Kalan Armada. He stepped away from his station, his talons clicking against the freezing metal floor. "The external temperature is negative 60 degrees and dropping. Every erg of heat we generate is instantly devoured by the atmospheric anomaly. The troops in the lower decks are already dead. Their armor froze to their scales. We are dying. Vrax." Vrax turned his molten orange eyes upon the insubordinate officer. In the past, such defiance would have been met with instant incineration. But Vrax felt the cold creeping into his own joints, a sluggish, terrifying numbness he had never experienced in a millennium of conquest. "You dare question my command?" Vrax growled, a plume of weak, lukewarm steam escaping his jaws. "I question your sanity," the officer fired back, his fear overriding his loyalty. "We conquered 1,000 worlds by imposing our will upon them. We burned their forests, boiled their oceans, and reshaped their atmospheres to suit our biology. But this world, this miserable, primitive rock, has weaponized its own nature against us. We cannot burn away a storm that feeds on our very heat." The mutiny was a stark reflection of the arrogant geopolitical failures Marcus and Elena had witnessed in the bunker. The Kalan possessed absolute technological supremacy, yet they entirely lacked harmony with the environments they invaded. They viewed nature as an obstacle to be annihilated, never understanding that a planet is a living, breathing system capable of violently defending itself. Their empire was a parasite, and Earth was finally rejecting it. "The core is destabilizing," the first sub-commander interrupted, his eyes wide with terror as he stared at the failing telemetry. "We are losing anti-gravity propulsion. We are going down." Vrax looked at the holographic display of the planet below. He had come to claim an easy prize, a fuel depot for his unstoppable armada. Now, he was being dragged down into a frozen grave by falling water and howling wind. The supreme technological might of the Kalan was nothing against the raw, ancient power of the Russian winter. "I prepare for terrestrial impact," Vrax ordered, his voice finally losing its thunderous authority. "All remaining personnel, brace for structural collapse." Down in the buried rover, the intimacy between Marcus and Elena was suddenly broken by a deafening, low-frequency groan that shook the earth beneath them. It was a sound that vibrated in their bones, louder than the howling wind, louder than the grinding ice. Marcus pulled back, his instincts instantly flaring. He wiped a layer of frost off the reinforced windshield and peered into the storm. The angry orange glow of the Solaris was no longer hanging in the sky. It was falling. "Elena," Marcus said, his voice tight. "The dreadnought is dropping. Their engines just failed." Elena scrambled back to her frozen console, her mind racing. The valley ahead of us, the geographic basin we were driving toward, it is a natural kill zone. The snowdrifts there are 20 meters deep. If they crash there, they will be buried alive, Marcus realized, a fierce, predatory grin returning to his face. But if any of them survive the impact, they are going to come out looking for heat. And we are the only thing warm for 100 miles. He turned back to the troop compartment, pounding a heavy fist against the sealed bulkhead. "Volkov, get your men ready. The main event just arrived." The metallic groan outside shifted into a deafening, concussive roar. The Solaris, stripped of its propulsion and starved of its energy, began its final blind descent into the very trap Elena had set, completely unaware of the kinetic ambush waiting for them in the ice. Gravity is a ruthless judge, but the Siberian ice is an absolute executioner. The massive Kalan dreadnought did not land. It plummeted from the sky like a dying, suffocated star, slamming into the exact geographic coordinates Elena had predicted. The impact hit the Earth with the force of a low-yield tectonic event. A massive shockwave of displaced air and pulverized snow blasted through the taiga, ripping century-old pine trees out by their roots and slamming into the buried Russian rover. Inside the darkened cabin, Marcus Vance threw himself over Elena Rostova, shielding her from the violent rattling as the heavy vehicle was nearly flipped onto its side by the concussive force. The reinforced glass of the windshield held, but it instantly frosted over with a thick layer of white ice, blinding them to the outside world. For a long, agonizing moment, the only sound was the howling of the hyperstorm and the metallic groans of the cooling rover. Then came the hissing. It was a massive, unnatural sound, like a volcano being quenched by an ocean. The dreadnought had crashed directly into a deep glacial basin, a natural valley where centuries of snowdrifts had accumulated to depths of over 60 feet. The sheer, residual heat of the alien hull immediately flash-boiled the top layer of snow, creating a localized, blinding fog bank of superheated steam that was instantly devoured and refrozen by the negative 60-degree ambient temperature of the blizzard. Marcus shoved the heavy driver's side door open with his shoulder, breaking the seal of ice that had already formed. The biting wind rushed into the cabin, stripping away whatever warmth they had managed to share. He stepped out into the raging whiteout, pulling his tactical goggles down over his eyes. "Volkov!" Marcus shouted over the roar of the wind. The heavy rear ramp of the rover dropped open with a metallic thud. The giant Russian guard and his 3 men emerged, entirely transformed. They had shed their bulky, standard-issue military coats for sleek, white winter camouflage suits. They carried archaic, wooden-stocked kinetic assault rifles and heavy bandoliers of explosive charges. Most importantly, they had strapped wide, woven snowshoes and short tactical skis to their boots. They were no longer soldiers of a modern, doomed army. They were apex predators of the tundra. Elena climbed out behind Marcus, clutching a heavy thermal scanning tablet she had salvaged from the rover's emergency kit. Her face was pale, but her eyes were alight with the fierce, calculating focus of a scientist watching her theory violently proven correct. "The Solaris is grounded half a mile dead ahead," Elena reported, her voice completely steady as she tapped the screen. "Their main plasma drives are dead. The hull temperature is dropping by 10 degrees every minute. They are trapped in a thermal sink." Marcus racked the charging handle of his kinetic rifle. "They won't stay inside. Vrax is going to send his best out to secure a perimeter and find whatever caused this storm. We have to hit them before they realize they are standing on quicksand." He looked at the Russian squad, then at Elena. She simply nodded, pulling a sidearm from the rover's armory and checking the magazine. She had mapped the structural weak points of the Kalan ships, and they needed her eyes on the battlefield to know where to strike. They moved out, gliding silently over the frozen crust of the snow. The contrast between their fluid, low-tech mobility and the high-tech nightmare unfolding ahead of them was staggering. Down in the basin, the dreadnought Solaris resembled a dying, glowing ember buried in a mountain of ash. The massive, obsidian-scaled ramp of the ship ground open. Supreme Commander Vrax, blinded by rage and entirely ignorant of the local geography, dispatched his Ignis Guard. These were the absolute elite of the Kalan Empire, towering, heavily armored shock troops who had subjugated hundreds of worlds. Their power suits were woven with thermal plasma conduits designed to project localized shields and power heavy, devastating energy weapons. They marched out of the ship in perfect formation, stepping off the heavy metal ramp and expecting to crush the primitive earth beneath their heavy, mechanized boots. Instead, the first rank simply vanished. The snow in the basin was entirely composed of deep, loose powder, offering absolutely no surface tension to support a species that weighed close to a ton in full armor. The Ignis Guard plunged waist deep, then chest deep into the freezing drifts. Panic, a deeply foreign emotion to the Kalan elites, instantly broke their formation. "The terrain is non-solid," a panicked alien voice shrieked over the unencrypted comms Elena was monitoring. "It is a microcrystalline suspension trap. We are sinking." The Kalan troops attempted to power their way out, engaging their heavy servo motors. It was the worst possible tactical decision. The servos, designed to operate in extreme heat, instantly seized as the super-cooled snow packed into their leg joints. The rapid thermal depletion was catastrophic. The metal of their armor became brittle. One of the alien guards, thrashing wildly in the chest-deep snow, raised his heavy plasma rifle, aiming blindly into the blinding white storm. He pulled the thermal trigger. The weapon attempted to draw ambient heat to ignite the plasma charge, found absolutely none in the freezing air, and instead sucked the residual warmth from its own structural housing. The resulting thermal shock caused the barrel of the rifle to shatter like cheap glass, sending jagged shards of cold, inert metal flying into the snow. High on the ridge above the basin, Marcus Vance raised his hand, signaling the Russian squad to halt. They had a perfect vantage point of the chaotic, floundering alien forces below. "They are statues," Volkov muttered, a dark, triumphant smile visible beneath his heavy scarf. "They brought fire to the ice, and now they are just heavy, freezing meat." "Target the orange thermal regulators on the back of their armor," Elena instructed, her voice cutting through the wind. She pointed her gloved hand toward the struggling aliens. "Those nodes are the only things keeping their internal life support active. Without them, the cold will reach their biology in seconds." Marcus lined up the iron sights of his rifle, placing the crosshairs dead center on a glowing orange node attached to an alien commander thrashing in the snow. He squeezed the trigger. The kinetic slug tore through the freezing air, propelled by a simple chemical gunpowder reaction entirely unaffected by the cold. It struck the thermal node with devastating precision. The orange glow instantly flickered and died. The massive alien let out a single, garbled scream of pure agony as the negative 60-degree temperature of the hyperstorm instantly invaded his suit. The creature stopped moving entirely, flash-frozen in place, becoming nothing more than a grotesque, obsidian ice sculpture. "Fire!" Marcus ordered. The ridge erupted in a synchronized volley of kinetic death. Volkov and his men unleashed a relentless barrage of heavy lead slugs down into the basin. The Kalan troops, trapped in the deep snow and entirely stripped of their energy shields by the cold, were sitting ducks. It was a total, humiliating slaughter. The elite vanguard of an interstellar empire was being systematically dismantled by 5 humans utilizing technology that had been obsolete in the galaxy for 10,000 years. The Kalan tried to return fire, but their plasma weapons continued to crack and fail, their energy beams sputtering into pathetic clouds of warm steam before they could even reach the ridge. The aliens attempted to retreat up the ramp of the Solaris, but their frozen joints locked up completely. They fell over one another, their massive armored bodies creating a roadblock of freezing metal. Elena watched the tactical feed on her scanner, her heart pounding with a mixture of terror and awe. The theory she had developed in a sterile laboratory was now a brutal, bloody reality playing out in the Siberian wilderness. The Kalan were arrogant. They had relied so heavily on their advanced heat-stealing technology that they had completely forgotten the fundamental laws of survival, adaptation, and respect for the environment. Humanity, however, had spent its entire existence surviving the harsh, unforgiving moods of its home planet. They knew how to layer their clothing, how to utilize friction, and how to turn the very terrain against an enemy. Down in the basin, the last of the Ignis guards stopped moving. The immediate area around the dreadnought was a graveyard of frozen, silent titans, half buried in the relentless, drifting snow. The hyperstorm raged on, completely indifferent to the interstellar tragedy it had just facilitated. "Cease fire," Marcus called out, lowering his weapon. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the wind. Volkov let out a heavy breath, patting the wooden stock of his rifle. "Good old lead. Never fails." Marcus turned to Elena. Her face was tight with anticipation. The immediate threat of the ground forces was neutralized, but the true prize still sat in the center of the valley. The dreadnought itself was a massive, sealed fortress. "They are going to lock the ship down," Marcus said, his eyes narrowing as the heavy metal ramp of the Solaris began to slowly, painfully grind shut, attempting to seal the remaining heat inside. "Vrax is going to try to wait out the storm." "He cannot," Elena replied, pointing to her scanner. "The structural integrity of the hull is failing. The metal is contracting violently due to the extreme cold. There are microfractures forming all along the primary exhaust vents." Marcus looked at the massive, darkening ship, then at the explosive charges strapped to Volkov's chest. The overarching threat of the Kalan armada still loomed over the rest of the world. But if they could capture the Supreme Commander and broadcast his defeat, the psychological blow to the alien forces would be devastating. They had a closing window of opportunity to breach the ship before it became an impenetrable, frozen tomb. The question was whether human cunning could navigate the failing, treacherous corridors of a dying alien sun, and exactly what Vrax would do when he realized he was cornered by the very species he had intended to exterminate. A dying starship sounds exactly like a breaking spine. The colossal hull of the Solaris groaned under the crushing weight of the Siberian winter, its invincible armor cracking like fragile glass beneath the relentless assault of the hyperstorm. Marcus Vance led the strike team down the steep, snow-packed embankment of the basin, sliding effortlessly on their tactical gear. The air was a chaotic swirl of freezing vapor and jagged ice crystals. Before them, the Kalan dreadnought sat dead in the drifts, its once glowing exterior reduced to a dull, frosted gray. The massive boarding ramp had seized halfway through its locking sequence, the hydraulic mechanisms frozen solid by the rapid thermal drop, leaving a narrow, jagged gap. But Marcus had no intention of using the front door. The structural integrity is failing fastest along the primary thermal exhaust vents, Elena shouted over the howling wind, consulting the glowing screen of her tablet. She pointed a gloved finger toward a massive cylindrical protrusion on the lower flank of the ship. The alien alloy was forged to expand and channel extreme heat. Forced into a rapid negative 60-degree contraction, the atomic bonds are tearing themselves apart. It is brittle. Marcus signaled to Volkov. The massive Russian soldier grinned beneath his heavy scarf, pulling a brick of high-yield plastic explosive from his bandolier. They moved swiftly to the exhaust vent. The surface of the alien metal was covered in a terrifying network of microfractures, snapping and popping audibly as the cold drove deeper into the ship's anatomy. Volkov pressed the kinetic charge directly into the deepest fissure, setting a crude 10-second chemical timer. "Fire in the ice," Volkov rumbled, turning and sliding back down the hull. The team took cover behind a massive frozen snowdrift. The detonation was not a fiery explosion, but a concussive, shattering shockwave. The compromised kaolin alloy simply could not absorb the kinetic energy. It shattered entirely, sending massive, jagged shards of dark metal raining down into the snow like broken pottery. A gaping 10-foot hole now led directly into the belly of the alien beast. "Move!" Marcus commanded, racking his rifle and stepping through the breach. They entered a nightmare. The interior of the Solaris, designed to maintain a comfortable ambient temperature of 130 degrees, had become a sprawling, pitch-black meat locker. Total system failure had cascaded through the dreadnought the moment the main plasma core stalled. The emergency lighting flickered weakly, casting long, pale, and terrifying shadows across ice-choked corridors. The air inside was completely dead, devoid of the mechanical hum of life support, replaced only by the eerie, cracking sound of the ship freezing from the inside out. Marcus and his team moved with ruthless, fast-paced precision, their boots crunching softly on the frost-covered metal grating. They passed the crew quarters, discovering the true, gruesome extent of the aliens' weakness. Towering kaolin engineers and soldiers were flash-frozen where they stood. Some were preserved mid-stride, rushing toward maintenance bays that had already failed. Others were huddled around dead thermal conduits, their obsidian scales coated in a thick, white rime. The hyperstorm had not just defeated them. It had turned their own fortress into a cryogenic tomb. They had no secondary environmental fail-safes, Elena whispered, stepping carefully over a frozen alien guard. Their entire technological doctrine assumed they would always dictate the climate. They never planned for a scenario where the environment was stronger than their engines. "Arrogance gets you killed faster than bullets," Marcus replied, keeping his rifle raised as they navigated a spiraling ramp leading to the upper decks. They met no resistance. The elite Ignis Guard who had survived the crash were either trapped outside in the basin or frozen solid in the lower airlocks. The cold had paralyzed the entire command structure of the kaolin vanguard. Elena kept her eyes glued to her scanner, tracking the single faint thermal signature remaining in the massive ship. It was weak, fading fast, but it was located squarely in the central command sphere. Marcus stacked the team up outside the heavy, ornate blast doors of the bridge. The doors were stuck open, the locking servos having seized from the ice. Marcus mirrored the corner, scanning the massive, circular room. Supreme Commander Vrax was there. He was no longer the terrifying, fiery conqueror who had demanded the absolute surrender of Earth. He was slumped heavily against the central holographic tactical table, his massive armored body shaking violently. The ambient temperature in the command sphere was hovering at 20 degrees below zero. Vrax's obsidian scales were dull, gray, and shedding a fine powder of frozen dead tissue. His breath came in shallow, pathetic puffs of lukewarm steam. Marcus stepped into the room, his kinetic rifle aimed squarely at the center of the alien commander's chest. Volkov and the Russian squad fanned out, securing the perimeter, their weapons trained on the dying giant. Elena walked in last, pulling her thick coat tighter against the chill, her eyes sweeping over the frozen alien technology with a mixture of awe and profound vindication. Vrax slowly raised his massive, heavy head. His molten orange eyes were dimming, the internal fire that fueled his biology desperately fighting a losing battle against the Siberian air. He looked at the humans. He saw their heavy furs, their insulated masks, their archaic kinetic weapons. He saw a primitive species that should have been eradicated in a single afternoon, standing comfortably in a temperature that was currently liquefying his internal organs. With a tremendous agonizing effort, Vrax raised a heavy plasma pistol from his belt. He pointed it at Marcus and pulled the firing mechanism. The weapon clicked harmlessly. The thermal battery had been entirely drained by the ambient cold. It was a useless block of frozen metal. Vrax let it drop to the floor, where it shattered into 3 distinct pieces upon impact. "What weapon did you deploy?" Vrax ground out, his voice a vibrating, shivering rasp that echoed through the dead bridge. He spoke through the universal translator collar around his neck, the digitized voice flat and devoid of its former thunder. "What dark technology stripped my armada from the sky? Speak, so I may know the instrument of my defeat." Marcus lowered his rifle just a fraction, stepping closer to the freezing commander. "We didn't deploy a weapon. Vrax. We just opened the window and let the weather in." Vrax stared at him, uncomprehending. The concept was entirely alien to him. Weather is a localized inconvenience. It does not cripple a galactic empire. Elena stepped forward, standing right beside Marcus. The dynamic between them was flawless, a perfectly balanced partnership of action and intellect. "Your empire is a parasite," Elena stated, her voice ringing clear and hard in the frozen room. "You siphon energy, you consume heat, and you build machines that assume the universe is a sterile laboratory. You surveyed our world and saw only fuel. You failed to realize that Earth is a living, breathing, violent system. We survive here not by conquering the elements, but by adapting to them. You brought fire to a planet that knows how to build an ice age." The profound moral lesson hung heavily in the freezing air. The Kaelin had spent millennia imposing their will upon the stars, never learning the vital importance of harmony. Their supreme technological might had been entirely dismantled by the simple, ancient turning of the seasons. Volkov stepped forward, retrieving a heavy, cold-forged steel binding chain from his pack. He completely ignored the alien's former status, roughly pulling Vrax's freezing, rigid arms behind his back and snapping the heavy steel locks shut. The freezing metal burned against Vrax's dying scales, a final, humiliating insult from a low-tech world. "We have the Supreme Commander," Marcus said, looking at Elena. The adrenaline was slowly beginning to fade, replaced by the grim reality of their next step. They had won the Battle of the Basin, but the war was far from over. Elena immediately moved to the primary communication console, pulling a heavily insulated interface cable from her bag and slicing it into the Kaelin mainframe. The ship's main power is dead, but their long-range subspace array has an independent chemical battery backup. If I can bypass the frozen encryption nodes, I can patch our signal directly into their global command network. Marcus watched her work, his mind racing through the tactical possibilities. They had captured the king, but the board was still covered in enemy pieces. The rest of the Kaelin armada, hundreds of heat-seeking dreadnoughts, were currently ravaging the warmer climates of the globe. If Elena could broadcast the live feed of Vrax in chains, freezing and defeated by primitive kinetic weapons and a snowstorm, the psychological shockwave could shatter the aliens' morale. They might retreat in terror, realizing their fundamental biological vulnerability had been exposed. Or in a fit of absolute arrogant rage, the remaining fleet commanders might choose vengeance, abandoning their conquest and deciding to simply glass the entire planet from high orbit. They were standing on the precipice of a new world, holding a fragile, frozen thread that could either strangle the alien empire or snap and doom them all. "Signal is green," Elena announced, her fingers hovering over the execution key, looking up at Marcus for the final order. A single transmission sent in the dead of winter holds the power to thaw an entire planet. Or in the case of the Kalan Empire, the power to shatter an invincible armada. Marcus Vance looked at Elena Rostova, his face a mask of absolute resolve, and gave a single, sharp nod. Elena pressed the execution key. The heavy insulated cable hummed with stolen chemical power, injecting a localized, heavily compressed data packet directly into the Kalan long-range subspace array. It bypassed their frozen encryption nodes with brutal primitive efficiency. Across the globe, high above the burning ruins of Earth's temperate zones, every active alien dreadnought, every command sphere, and every scout ship suddenly lost its primary tactical feed. The glowing holographic displays flickered violently, and a single unified image replaced them. It was a live, unedited visual feed of Supreme Commander Vrax. The apex predator of 1,000 conquered worlds was on his knees. Heavy, cold-forged steel chains bound his massive wrists behind his back. His obsidian scales, once radiating the heat of a dying sun, were dull, gray, and flaking, covered in a humiliating layer of white frost. Standing over him were ordinary human beings wrapped in thick furs, holding archaic, kinetic weapons. There were no grand energy shields. There was no highly advanced plasma artillery. There was just lead, steel, and the raw, unforgiving cold of the Russian taiga. The psychological impact was instantaneous and devastating. In the tropical zones, Kalan sub-commanders stared at the broadcast in absolute horror. Their supreme leader had not been defeated by a superior superweapon or a larger interstellar fleet. He had been utterly dismantled by the ambient environment of the planet they intended to casually consume. The biological and technological vulnerabilities they had aggressively ignored for millennia were suddenly exposed for the entire armada to witness. The illusion of their invincibility shattered entirely. Panic, a dark contagion the Kalan had never experienced in their long history of conquest, swept fiercely through their ranks. Several dreadnought captains, blinded by arrogant rage and refusing to accept the visual evidence, immediately broke formation. They diverted their massive ships northward, determined to vaporize the source of the broadcast and restore their empire's honor. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. As the massive ships crossed the temperate lines, leaving the comfortable heat of the equator, the ambient energy they relied upon vanished. The Russian winter, supercharged by Elena's geoengineering grid, swallowed them whole. One by one, the massive dreadnoughts starved. Their open-loop intakes sucked in freezing, dense air, rapidly cooling their plasma cores. Their engines stalled in mid-flight. They plummeted from the sky like heavy stones, crashing violently into the taiga, the frozen oceans, and the ice-choked mountains of the north. They became massive, dead monuments to their own profound hubris. The remaining fleet commanders in the equatorial zones watched their comrades fall from the sky and realized the terrible, undeniable truth. They could not hold a world that actively weaponized its own seasons against them. Without the ability to traverse the entire globe, their occupation was entirely fractured and unsustainable. In a chaotic, uncoordinated scramble, the surviving Kalan dreadnoughts ignited their primary fusion thrusters, burning their emergency reserves to tear themselves free of Earth's gravity well. They fled into the dark void of space, a broken, terrified armada leaving behind a scarred but victorious world. The months that followed were a grueling test of human endurance, but the suffocating shadow of absolute extinction had finally lifted. Slowly, inevitably, the Earth continued its ancient, unstoppable rhythm. The brutal, hypercharged winter finally broke. Spring arrived. The snows of the Eurasian steppes began to melt, feeding swollen, rushing rivers and revealing the true, staggering cost of the invasion. The Siberian taiga was forever altered. Rusted, decaying mountains of dark alien metal littered the pristine landscape, already becoming overgrown with the fierce, resilient green of new pine saplings. The invulnerable armor of the Kalan dreadnoughts had oxidized rapidly in the moisture-rich, thawing environment, turning the terrifying warships into hollow, crumbling caves. The fearsome Ignis Guard, once the terror of the galaxy, were nothing more than empty. Cracked shells sinking deep into the spring mud. The geopolitical landscape of humanity had experienced an equally profound thaw. The old divisions, the arbitrary borders drawn in blood over centuries of petty conflict, meant absolutely nothing in the wake of the Kalan invasion. The appeasement faction, those cowardly leaders who had begged to surrender the planet from their deep underground bunkers, were quietly and permanently removed from the remnants of power. A new, unified global council emerged from the ashes of the old nations. They were a deeply humbled species. Humanity finally understood a vital moral lesson that the Kalan had ignored. Technological progression and military supremacy were entirely meaningless if they came at the cost of the natural world. Earth was not merely a rock to be mined or a resource to be carelessly exploited. It was a living, breathing ally. It possessed a delicate, powerful balance that had quite literally saved them from absolute annihilation. Marcus Vance and Dr. Elena Rostova stood together on a high, rocky ridge overlooking the Krasnoyarsk basin. The terrifying hyperstorm was a distant memory, replaced by a crisp, clear spring breeze that carried the scent of wet pine and damp earth. Below them, the rusted, massive husk of the dreadnought Solaris lay half-submerged in a newly formed, crystal-clear meltwater lake. The terrifying alien metal was already being reclaimed by the earth, covered in creeping green vines and vibrant patches of moss. Marcus wore a simple canvas jacket, his days of shadow operations and geopolitical sabotage entirely behind him. He looked down at the ruined ship, then turned to look at Elena. They came here to consume the world. Marcus reflected quietly, a sense of profound peace settling over his previously cynical features, and the world simply swallowed them whole. Elena smiled, a genuine warm expression that reached her bright green eyes and completely erased the harsh edges she used to wear. She stepped closer, leaning her shoulder against his, her hand naturally finding his. We spent so much time looking up at the stars, terrified of what might be out there waiting in the dark. Elena said, her voice soft against the wind. We forgot to look down and respect what was right under our feet. The planet protected us, Marcus. Now, it is our turn to protect it. Marcus pulled her close, wrapping his arm around her waist as they watched the spring sunlight catch the gentle ripples of the lake. Humanity had survived its darkest hour by embracing the cold and trusting the earth. The stars were still out there, vast and full of unknown threats. The Kalan Empire might attempt to return one day, or something entirely worse might take their place in the endless void. But as Marcus held the woman who had bravely brought the sky down on an alien god, he knew Earth would never again be caught defenseless. The fire of human defiance was finally burning in perfect, enduring harmony with the world that birthed it. Thank you for watching this story unfold. If you enjoyed this journey into the freezing heart of defiance, make sure to like, subscribe, and share this video with your friends. Your support is exactly what keeps these original stories alive. Please hit that hype button so this channel can reach more sci-fi fans just like you. And I want to know you made it to the very end of the journey. Drop down into the comments right now and leave the word Frost so I know who the true survivors are. Until next time, stay warm and keep watching the skies.